Next curve.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Next Curve reThink webcast or podcast and our series on security and trust, where we talk about the hot topics in the world of technology, privacy, security, and trust that matter. And I'm joined by my good friend and collaborator here, the Data Diva, Debbie Reynolds of Debbie Reynolds Consulting LLC. She is the who's who, literally the entire who's who's list on anything related to privacy, security, and trust. So it's great to have you.
Well, I'm glad to be here as always. So I'm happy that you reach out to me when wacky things happen.
Yeah, I don't even know why we do this, because you're just a fixture now. You know what I'm saying? You might as well just like skip over all this stuff. But hey, we're going to be talking about something really interesting, the EU AI Act. And you and I, we've been talking about generative AI, ethical AI, all these various AI topics, which I think are not getting any clearer in terms of how people are talking about all this stuff. In fact, cloudier. But yes, the European Commission dropped this big one, right? It's been in the works for a while, but now this stuff is in law. It has been instituted into law, right? The EU AI Act. So I'm looking forward to getting your thoughts on this, Debbie, but also just drilling down into some of the details and nuances of what we're looking at here and what sort of implications it's going to have for businesses, enterprises, organizations, right, going forward. So, but before that, hey everyone, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment, react to this podcast, and check us out here at www.next-curve.com. That's the Next Curve research site. And later on, toward the end of the program here, we will let Debbie Reynolds share her contact information and let you know how you can get engaged with the wonderful work she's doing. But yes, like, share, subscribe. And with that, hey, let's get started. The EU AI Act. What is it? What do you think? What is it? I think.
That's a great question. First of all, the European Union has been working on this for a number of years. So the Artificial Intelligence Act now is a law in the European Union, and it manages any company that uses data of anyone in the European Union that has to do with artificial intelligence. It is a massive law. It has huge implications, not only for Europe, but also companies outside of Europe that are working with people's data in Europe. And then also, I think it will have a massive impact around the world, because the European Union actually now is the first jurisdiction to basically plant their flag on the moon about AI. So this is what we think about AI. This is what we think, how you need to think about AI. And because, just being the first, I think that just makes it even more influential. So a lot of jurisdictions that are thinking about AI, they're looking very closely at this act. A lot of companies that are thinking about AI, even though they may not be in the European Union, they probably will be forming a lot of their, aligning what they're doing with what the EU is doing. So basically what they've done is they've created a law that really takes a risk-based approach to artificial intelligence and sort of centered it around humans and the harm that can happen to humans. So what you can do with artificial intelligence in the European Union is dependent on how you fall within this categorization they have about how harmful your tool can be to humans. And then also it has roles. So based on the different roles that you play, whether you're someone who's implementing, deploying, if you're an affiliate of another company, there are responsibilities for all those different layers of people. And so companies really need to sort of think about where they fall in that place, and see, what will be their responsibilities. Because I think what's going to happen is that other jurisdictions, very similar to what happened with the General Data Protection Regulation, where it was, even though other countries didn't adopt it wholesale, they took bits and pieces of it, and a lot of it is kind of the language and the categorization and how they define certain things. So I think any company, any organization that's doing artificial intelligence needs to look very closely at this, because I think, in the future, other jurisdictions who decide to do laws will probably borrow very liberally from this regulation.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm glad that you brought up GDPR, because that particular regulation and set of laws has had a huge impact globally, right? And it does subjugate jurisdictions outside of the EU to a lot of its terms and conditions, requirements, legal requirements. So, or statutory requirements. And so, it's interesting to see that EU continue to push this. But one of the things that I noted, and I did read through the act, is a lot of the activity around framing this, it goes back to like 2017, right? And so, like what you're saying, they've been working on this for quite some time. One of the things I noticed about it, and is that it is a little bit of an anachronism, it's really, it was drafted in reaction to a different time and a different place in our thinking about AI, right? And at the time, the idea of trustworthy AI, although they include that language in the act and some of the drafts and proposals that preceded it, and that it's based on, really the concern was around ethical AI. Is this ethical? What is the impact on society? Does it foster inclusiveness, and does it foster equity? And that was really where we were at the time. And when you read the language and the scope of the act, it seems like it addresses 2017 and prior. Now, with the advent of generative AI, I think we're looking at something much different. And one of the things that really popped out for me was really loose treatment of generative AI. It seems like there's probably going to be an uptake to this. I mean, there is, in that there are some transparency requirements that are outlined for generative AI, but as a whole, I think the act didn't quite anticipate what we're probably going to be looking at in terms of additional concerns related to generative AI, right? Because a lot of this was more of, do you have unbiased analysis that's coming out that informs humans? Is not about generation of content and information that is synthetically created, right? That's different. Your reaction.
Yeah. So I guess you're right in some regard, right? Because this regulation did start before people went crazy about generative AI. It does have a part in there, what they call general purpose models. So there's special things that are related to that. But I think the challenge with generative AI is that, much of what we have experienced in AI before we got to general purpose AI were purpose-built AI systems, right? So they were more narrowly scoped. The features were very defined. They were narrow in terms of how they were being implemented. I think generative AI tools are so different from that, where it really, the harm depends on how the company, what data the company is using and how they use it, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so it really isn't, and to their credit, I think is a good idea that they went kind of the risk-based approach, right? So
Yeah.
you got
Yeah.
to figure out where your AI use fits into that approach. So, for example, within 6 months of this law going into effect, certain types of AI uses will be prohibited in the EU. So things that we see all the time on the news, like pre-crime AI
Yeah. Yeah.
or
Yeah. Yeah.
subliminal message AI or emotional AI, where you're like, oh, this person looks angry, so let's not give them a loan. So those things you cannot even do anymore in the EU. And again, they're the first jurisdiction that ever said that. Where right now we have companies like in the US. Here's a good example. There was a company that was in business, and they were saying if you take a selfie of your private parts and you send it to them, and they can tell whether someone has an STD or not or whatever. And so this is an actual company. It was in business. They were making money. They had thousands of users, and the FTC basically shut them down, or basically the FTC
Yeah.
like threw the hammer at them. They decided they were going to shut down because they couldn't support the claims they were making. They didn't have a good way to protect this data they were collecting. They didn't know the age really of the people
Yeah.
who were taking these like explicit photos. So
Yeah.
all those things kind of shut them down. So
Hmm.
in the EU, a company like that wouldn't even be able to exist. You couldn't even do business, right? Based on what they're doing, the harm level. So, taking very sensitive data of someone, saying that you're making these scientific claims and all this stuff, not knowing how old people were, like it could be teenagers that are taking pictures, none of those, that business could not exist in Europe. So I think taking more of a risk-based approach in those things, I think is the best way forward. And then, as opposed to, let's see these companies, do business, do harmful things, and then let's slam them later. So
Yeah. Yeah.
very different.
Yeah, and I think there's a degree of tracking and classification that they're trying to do, right? Of a lot of these systems and applications. What's really interesting is the use of the term AI system. And I know when you read some of the briefs that were really not that brief, they're pretty long. There was a lot of debate about terminology and definitions, and you and I talk about this all the time. And I was like, well, what do you mean by AI? AI it's wide, expansive, and it's also really deep. What do you mean by it? And what is an AI system versus, let's say, the application? And where I kind of saw and maybe this is by design. Again, you're talking about risk-based approach. Maybe this is it caters to the risk-based approach from a technical perspective. But I see that there is a difference between the AI system and the application itself, right? And so, you're going to have a certain set of requirements for the system, which might include the model, the data, and it might include aspects of the algorithm itself that you might build, especially if you're a supplier to somebody else who's building AI applications, right? Where the app, and there could be a number of different permutations of quote unquote AI system, but then you bump into the problem of AI as just a enabling technology that's going to be infused into everything. And I think the Act does a pretty good job of recognizing that, and how maybe it'll be impossible to enforce a law of this scale across something that is so it is going to be quite ubiquitous, right? And so being able to target things that are really going to create risk to the purpose and the charter of this law. I think that risk-based approach probably makes a lot of sense, but I think there needs also to be a treatment of the applications themselves, right? Because that's really how harm can be expressed. Might not necessarily be the AI system, depending on what part of that AI system, who owns it, and what its function is in anything that might be deemed harmful or non-compliant, right?
Yeah, right. I think it's gonna be challenging. I think what they tried to do is separate what they tried to define as an AI system versus an AI model.
Yeah.
Because you can have a model, not a system. You know what I'm saying? Or you can have, or those things can be separate. I think what they want to do is to have people try to figure out where they fit into these buckets of definitions that they have, because they may, let's say, for instance, they have an enforcement action. They may say, okay, your system is fine, but then this model or this, or let's say, quote unquote, model is a euphemism for, use case or type of way that you use AI, so we think, okay, everything else you're doing AI is fine with your system, but this particular use case we don't think is okay. So we want you to either change it, stop it, look at the risk. So they basically, I think the reason why they did is that they don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to say, everything is, bad. Like we've seen, for example, in the US, the FTC has been doing some really good enforcement work, actually. But some of the things that we've seen, especially around actions that they take against companies that have data of children. So companies that have algorithms, they have data of children, AI systems, and a lot of their arguments have been, well, I know that you don't like us to use, for example, pictures of children in our AI. We thought they were over 13, but they're not, or whatever. And they were like, well, it's too hard to take the data out. And so the FTC was like, well, then we want you to delete all the images, and we want you to delete the model, and we want you to delete the algorithms, right? So for some companies, that may be their whole business, right? So they may have to delete everything they're working on. So I think part of what the AI Act is trying to do is try to differentiate models from systems, so saying, okay, if you stop this particular use case in a quote unquote model or whatever, that doesn't mean that your whole business will be kaput, because we're not saying, the system may be fine, but the way that you're using it may not be okay.
Okay. And so now that you speak of that, let's talk about the implications on businesses and big tech specifically, right? Because you've highlighted now that there are going to be some compliance requirements, or maybe even some regulatory impact, after the fact. We know a lot of that's going to happen, but what are your thoughts there? Implications on businesses, but then also, big tech, right? Because we talked about the global, the potential and likely global scope of or impact of this law. What are your thoughts there, Debbie?
Yeah. Well, big tech or other tech companies who have used AI for many, many years, a long time, they have not ever had to be transparent in how they use those tools, right? So they never had to categorize how they use it. They never had to think about it in terms of a human harm thing. It was like, okay, what can I do that can make the most money? Right. So if you think, for example, about, let's say that company Clearview AI, this is a company that was using tech for ads and different things, and they decided that they were going to move over into this biometric thing. So, for them, it wasn't really about harm. It's like, okay, can I make money doing this? So that was not even a consideration. Where now what this AI Act is doing, and I think it's going to trickle across all jurisdictions, is that jurisdictions are going to want to know, okay, if you're using AI, what harm bucket does your AI fall into, right? So is it something that should be prohibited or would have been prohibited in other jurisdictions? To me, when you say it like that, it's almost like when you see certain chemicals in different jurisdictions or different countries are banned. Like when I go to Europe, certain things we use in the U.S. you can't use there because they're banned because we think, oh, it's harmful or whatever. So I think AI is going to be like that, where people are like, well, wait a minute, like this tool that I'm being sold, like, it's not even legal in Europe, So I think it'll have people really look at it, but I think companies are going to have to. And we're seeing this a little bit of this in the US already. Companies are going to have to really categorize their AI systems by those harm levels. So a little bit of what we're seeing about this in the US is like the SEC has been telling companies, if you use AI, shareholders want to know how you're using it, right? And so there are a couple of big companies, some of the biggest companies really push back on that because they're like, hey, we just use it for, we use AI all the time. We use it for all types of business systems. It would be hard for us to explain to an investor or in a shareholder call how we use AI. So in order to do that, they will have to be able to categorize it in some way. So I think what the AI Act has done was give them kind of that blueprint that they can use, where they can say, hey, we're using this these are low risk, this is medium risk, this is, high risk, or however they want to, however they want to talk about it. But I think it's going to bring an unparalleled level of transparency, even if we as a society are not knowing every single, detail about how people are using it. At least it gives us a framework in which we can categorize it and think about it from like a human perspective, right? So in the US, we're all consumer, right, perspective, where this is more about human perspective. So I guess in the US, that would translate to consumer harm or consumer risk. So I think it's really important what they've done.
Yeah. And so it looks like a lot of these AI regulations globally it's going to be kind of lumpy for a while, right? Maybe some bifurcation, even with GDPR, we still have a lot of U.S. companies that exhibit, let's say, non-privacy first behaviors, like, opting you in by default, even if you go and are, selecting your, do not sell my information type of, configurations, and for the cookies as well, right? It seems like the behaviors are inconsistent and globally, and we'll probably get the same thing with AI. And what kind of challenges are you seeing some of the bigger companies, quote unquote, big tech companies in complying against what looks like a pretty uneven and inconsistent regulatory regime for even privacy, Now, what do you think that's going to do? What they're going to experience with this new EU AI Act?
I think it's going to definitely add some complexity to companies in terms of how they think about. Sorry for my background. I have Blue Angels are flying over my house right now. We're having an air show this week.
I can't hear anything, so that's amazing.
Yeah, so I think it's going to definitely bring some complexity. I guess it'll be as complex as companies want to make it, in my view, right? So, so going back to like their risk levels, right? So a lot of ways that companies use artificial intelligence now aren't going to be risky at all. So the regulate beyond the fact that you say, okay, we're categorizing this as low risk because it has very few human harms. That's probably all that you have to do, right? For those things. And I think a lot of companies that are using artificial intelligence will probably fall into those low or medium risk cases. And so for that, I think that'll be great. But I think even if companies feel like, okay, I'm not using AI for these harmful things, I don't need to worry about it. What they really need to do is try to figure out where they fit in those risk buckets. If they ever think that they're going to do business with anyone in Europe, right? And then So a lot of it is not about kind of volume of data. It's just about around the use and around kind of that personal use. And so for big companies, I think they should have already exercised this muscle if they were doing anything on privacy, because that's what privacy is about as well. So it's about, the less the less personally identifiable information that you use, the less you are going to be subject to a lot of these regulatory problems around data. So I think those things track together. And also the EU, they try to do regulation like this, almost like puzzle pieces. So things sort of fit in puzzles. So they're like things like GDPR, they're not overlapping at all, but they have different ways to do it. And part of what you're talking about with generative AI, some of the issues that we're grappling with around like IP, intellectual property, trademark, all that stuff. They have other regulations to deal with that, right? So that's a different part of the puzzle that they're dealing with. And so I think the complexity will be depending on the jurisdiction you're dealing with, what they're looking for. But, my view always is that, if you're reacting to a regulation, that's like a tactic. That's not a strategy.
Yeah.
So the strategy needs to be, what is our data story? What is our data plan? Where do we fall? So if companies can work on that, it'll be easier for them to comply with regulation because they've already answered these questions.
Well, I mean, it's a bit of a risk mitigation approach, right? When you can mitigate risk if you actually know about the regulation, and then you make judgments on how, which direction you want to evolve your products or even innovate. And so, I have a question. So how do you think this dovetails in with the White House, that whole AI, responsible AI declaration that many U.S. tech companies made when they got together at the White House?
Oh, okay, yeah, I saw that. Wow, that's gonna be interesting. So basically, it was like an agreement, like we pinky swear that we're gonna do all cool, awesome, responsible things with AI. I think
Swear
voluntary commitments, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But we're already seeing, unfortunately, some of the names of those people, companies that have signed that thing have already done things that are, have run afoul of kind of those quote unquote voluntary agreements. So I think, in the future, we'll see how the U.S. falls on that in terms of how they want to do any type of regulation. I think, the European is going straight for the regulation route, and we haven't done that yet in the U.S., So we're more, what are the frameworks? What are the things we need to think about? Then if you do something bad, then your hand is going to get slapped if the FCC goes after you or something. So we'll see how that relates. But, the fact of the matter is, in the U.S., is kind of business as usual. I think, there are going to be, the FTC can't go after everybody. So they basically make examples out of companies. They'll take a company that's doing something really bad and they make an example out of them. And so, that's the way that things have gone here. I don't know how in the U.S. we're going to, I'm not sure how in the U.S. we're going to try to regulate AI, even though we want to do stuff in AI, and we don't want to, no one wants to stop innovation, right? But I think the problem with that, and this goes back again to the way that the European Union has approached this, is that certain use cases that are harmful to humans, there will be no adequate legal redress, right? So they're like, well, we just don't want you to, do pre-crime. There are, I've read some horrifying stories recently about companies trying to use AI for pre-crime. Basically, okay, if your grass is not mowed or something, we're gonna target your family or something because we think because your grass is not, people don't cut their grass need to have higher property insurance rates, or they get bad credit or something. Stupid things that people try to do with AI. Correlation is not causation.
Yeah.
Certainly isn't like a pre-crime situation. And my view is, unfortunately, like I say, George Orwell's 1984 was supposed to be a cautionary tale, not a recipe book. So yeah, stop.
Good. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
So now you mentioned innovation. Let's talk about innovation and competition for a bit. I mean, there's folks, and it's obvious that in a lot of the debates that occurred in the run-up of the EU AI Act becoming law, there was a lot of debate about how and concern about overregulation, right? So what are some of your thoughts here and recommendations, maybe even around some of the concerns related to innovation and competition?
Yeah. I personally, obviously big companies don't like regulation because they feel like, oh, we can grow. And, I've heard people say, oh, the European Union has done it again. And it's the reason why they don't have big tech companies, because they, are, very regulated. And, I can see that how people make that assumption, but the goal is that they want to have products and services that help people and not harm people. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Just like we have the FDA, we have things to say, okay, we don't want, if someone's going to make product, sell you produce, has gone through certain, safety checks before you get it, instead of like, oh, everyone ate salad and got sick. It's like, well, it's your problem, so they're thinking of it in terms of a safety issue for people. And from my view, I think, the majority of AI uses the companies use probably, again, won't be in those high risk or unacceptable risk categories. Some of them will be, obviously, but the vast majority won't be. So I think understanding where you kind of fit into that space. And I think it also to be helpful for companies. Let's say companies aren't using any high risk things right now, but then they decide, okay, we're going to do this new thing, but they may not have a framework or frame of mind to think, okay, so what is the risk? Are we even thinking about human risk at all when we're implementing these things? So I think that needs to be, I think it's a good thing that it can help companies really think through, risk from not just, especially in the US, we think about risk in terms of like shareholder risk, not like human risk to the people who actually may be harmed, right? So
it's really odd if you think about it. And it's also I don't know how you describe it. Strange that we here in the United States have to look at these risks and potential harms once we have the EU put things in motion. I mean, it seems like regulatory leadership is coming out of the EU, and there's a lot of reasons why, right? Things that seem obvious and others that are not so obvious. There's definitely concerns in the EU about about these technologies and concerns beyond that, right? We won't get into that, but it is interesting to see how the EU continues to move some of these critical topics, regulatory topics, ahead of the United States, and at the moment are exerting their leadership, whether you like it or not, right, is another thing. But in terms of innovation, I think, look back at GDPR and how companies had to react to that. I think that's one of the things that a lot of companies that are wondering, well, what do we do? How do we manage our business and the way that we innovate going forward? Think in terms of how you've had to react to GDPR. I mean, is that something that you would agree with?
I would agree. I mean, again, I think it aligns very closely to that around risk and harm of people. I think, Europe and the US have a very different point of view about harm. So in the US, it's more like, oh, you broke your arm, so let's sue this person, right? As opposed to, you've created some type of emotional or mental damage to someone, and maybe they don't think about that as harm, right? Unless,
Yeah.
okay, did you lose your job? Did you not be able to do some functioning that you were doing before? Where Europe is like, we don't even want to go there. Like, we don't want you to even do things that could possibly create those types of harm. So, it is more of like, the carrot versus the stick type of thing. And even the way that they have gone after, it's so funny because when the General Data Protection Regulation came out, companies were really afraid that the EU would like start these huge cases against them like right away, and that just did not happen. So people are like, when is the enforcement going to happen? It's like, what they really want you to do is not harm people, right? So they basically try to work with the company like how can we fix this or get it into the right place so that you can still do business but not do it in a harmful way. And they've actually going out of their way not to fine companies. Like, so the fines that come to companies is after they've done all these other steps, right? As opposed to, let's just slam you right now. You pay like, $5 billion and then you're on your way and doing whatever. So what they're really looking for companies to do is behavior change. And in the US, it's more like, okay, you've done something bad, we'll sue you, you settle out of court, and then you continue to do what you were doing before and promise, quote unquote, that you won't do it again until your next case goes up. So I think it's just a very different mental shift, but I think it's a shift that has to happen because, not everybody can afford to do these cases, right? Like, we're having a huge problem in the US around content, right? So content creators are saying, these companies are stealing my ideas. They're using generative AI models. And if you're a small company, can you do a case against, these AI tools, these multi-billion-dollar companies? No, you can't, right? So it's basically you're hoping that maybe they duke it out with another billion-dollar company and you can benefit from it in some way, right? And so in the meantime, what happens? Do you go out of business as a small business or whatever? Where the EU is like, hey, we don't want you to even start that. Like, don't even go there with these types of things. So you have to consider that beforehand.
Yeah, and then speaking of the fines, they can be up to 30. I think it's 30 million or 30 million euros, not US dollars, or 6% of total worldwide annual turnover. So it to GDPR in a lot of ways, right?
Well, it's 7% of global worldwide turnover, or 35 billion euros, whichever is higher.
Okay. Right. Yeah. So that's a lot for companies to chew on, but it's going to be interesting to see how they evolve the law as well, because we're seeing a lot of chatter, and there was a lot of debate during the course of drafting the law or the act that are not yet resolved, but that's a good thing, I think, because AI, quote unquote, AI is always changing. I mean, with generative AI, it boils down to transparency requirements, right? I think, and a lot of it just gravitating around, disclosing, making sure that content that's generated with AI has a watermark or is distinguishable from non-Gen AI fabricated content, and that it's legal content, sourced legally, things like that. What you mentioned before, copyright and IP protection. So it'll be interesting to see how the law evolves, and then also how how businesses globally will have to adjust to mitigate their risk, right? And going back to what you mentioned before, this looks like that similar risk-based framework that we've seen before coming out of the EU. But it's not done yet. This is going to be a fluid thing. So with that, hey, Debbie, Data Diva, thank you so much for jumping on. I think there's a lot for our audience to chew on here. And quite frankly, you had my head, not only spinning, but churning, and a lot of the insights that you'd shared with us here. And, I think we're going to be continuing this discussion. But to our audience, if you want to know how things are changing, what your business needs to do to react to those changes as these AI regulations evolve around the world, Data Diva, Debbie Reynolds is the person to reach out to, and you can reach out to me too, and we can provide you with some guidance on how to navigate what are going to be probably some pretty choppy waters going forward, simply because things are moving so quickly. Technology doesn't stop, right? And the implications are getting deeper and broader. So with that, hey, Debbie, why don't you share with our audience how they can get in touch with you and tap the wonderful resources that is the Data Diva?
Excellent. Thank you so much. This was a great conversation as always. So I'm happy that we're going to be talking about this for many years to come. So anyone can reach out to me on my website, DebbieReynoldsConsulting.com, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn. Just type in Data Diva Debbie Reynolds and my name pops right up.
Awesome. And everyone, thanks for joining us. We'll see you in the next installment. But remember, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. The easiest thing to do is subscribe to our research portal and media center at www.next-curve.com. It's a great one-stop shop place for all Next Curve research content media, and you will be notified when we publish new stuff like this. And you will want to go there for the tech and industry insights that matter. And we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot, Data Diva.
Thank you so much.